Welcome to Once Upon a Dream, your haven for soothing bedtime stories that bring calm and magic to your nights. If you found peace or joy in our stories and would like to support the channel, buying us a virtual coffee is a wonderful way to help keep this dream alive. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support means the world to us. Good evening. My name is Ben, and I'll be your guide tonight as we journey together into deep relaxation and restful sleep. Take a deep breath in through your nose, and as you exhale, feel the tension in your body begin to melt away. Allow your eyes to gently close and bring your attention to the soothing rhythm of your breath. With each inhale, invite calm and stillness into your body. And with each exhale, let go of any worries or thoughts from the day. Relaxing every muscle, every joint, and every cell. You are safe. You are calm. And you are ready to drift into a deep and restful sleep. Our story takes place in the quietest part of winter, when snow blankets the world in hushed wonder, and kitchen windows glow like warm beacons in the early darkness. It's a tale about finding unexpected connections, the comfort of good food, and the gentle unfolding of love. As you prepare to enter this world of soft snowfall and warm kitchens, let your breathing find its natural rhythm. There's no need to remember every detail or follow every word. Simply let the story wash over you like a cozy blanket. Let's begin our journey to a small Vermont town, where two people are about to discover that sometimes the best things in life, like the perfect cup of tea, take time to steep. Chapter 1: Bitter Aftertaste. The January snow fell in lazy spirals outside Daniel Sullivan's kitchen window, each flake catching the warm light of late afternoon. He stood watching them drift, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes labeled kitchen in careful black marker. The quiet of his new Vermont rental felt worlds away from the constant clamor of his Chicago restaurant kitchen. And he was still deciding if that was a good thing. A particular box had been calling to him all afternoon. The one containing his grandmother's copper pots. He'd been avoiding it since arriving 3 days ago, knowing that unwrapping each pot would feel like unwrapping memories of his restaurant's final days. But as the snow continued its gentle descent, he found himself kneeling beside the box, slowly pulling away layers of bubble wrap. The first pot emerged gleaming in the winter light, its surface reflecting the warm glow of his kitchen. He was running his thumb over a small dent in its rim, a familiar comfort, when a voice drifted through his slightly open window. The problem with Sullivan's wasn't just its fall from grace, the voice said, clear and thoughtful. It was the way it lost its soul. Daniel's hands stilled on the copper pot. He knew that voice. Or rather, he knew of it. Sophie Chen, the food blogger whose reviews had become required reading in the Chicago restaurant scene. He'd had no idea she lived in Vermont, let alone next door. The final service, her voice continued, presumably recording her review, felt like watching a star collapse. Each dish emerged from the kitchen like a cry for help, but nobody was listening anymore. The words should have stung more than they did, Daniel thought. Maybe the snow was softening everything, even old wounds. He placed the pot carefully on his counter, its copper surface catching the last rays of sunlight. He heard the soft click of a recording device being turned off, followed by the gentle sounds of movement next door. Kitchen cabinets opening and closing. The clink of metal on metal. The familiar domestic symphony of someone preparing to cook. A few minutes passed in silence. Then a sharp beeping cut through the quiet, followed by the unmistakable scent of something burning. The food blogger's voice, so professional moments ago, shifted to panicked. No, not again. Without thinking, Daniel was already moving toward his door. The sound of a smoke alarm might as well have been a dinner service bell. his body responded to kitchen emergencies on instinct. He found himself on his neighbor's porch, watching through her kitchen window as she waved a dish towel frantically at a smoking pan. Her dark hair was escaping from a messy bun, and she wore a sweater that appeared to be dusted with flour. When she saw him through the window, she froze for a moment before hurrying to open the door. "Hi," she managed, still waving the dish towel with her other hand. "I don't suppose you know anything about caramelizing sugar?" The corner of Daniel's mouth lifted slightly. "A little," he said, and followed her into the kitchen. Sophie's kitchen was warm and cluttered in a way that spoke of actual use. Cookbook pages marked with sticky notes, a collection of mismatched but well-seasoned pots, and a spice rack that looked like it had been organized by frequency of use rather than aesthetics. The smoking pan on the stove contained what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at caramel. "I was trying to make honeycomb candy," she explained, looking embarrassed, "for a blog post about homemade Valentine's Day gifts. Though I suppose I could repurpose it into a piece about the kitchen fire safety." Daniel moved to the stove with the quiet efficiency of someone used to kitchen disasters. He turned off the heat, and finding her sink already filled with cold water, carefully submerged the pan's bottom. The angry sizzle of sugar-meeting water filled the kitchen. "Candy thermometer?" he asked softly. "I thought I could eyeball it," Sophie admitted. "Hubris, thy name is amateur candy making." The steam from the cooling pan rose between them like a gentle veil, carrying the oddly pleasant scent of burnt sugar. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding a layer of hush to the fading afternoon light. "I'm Sophie," she said, extending a hand that had a small burn scar on the thumb, a badge of honor among people who loved to cook. "I just moved in last week. I'm guessing you're the mysterious new tenant next door." "Daniel," he replied, shaking her hand and choosing not to add his last name. "And yes, guilty as charged." She smiled, and he noticed how it softened her whole face. "Well, Daniel, as thanks for preventing my kitchen from becoming a cautionary tale, would you like some tea?" I have a ginger blend that's perfect for winter afternoons." He should say no, he thought, should go back to his quiet house and his unpacked boxes and his carefully maintained anonymity. But the kitchen was warm. The snow was falling. And there was something about the way she had already pulled out 2 mismatched mugs that made him nod. "Tea would be nice," he said, and settled into the chair she offered, watching as she moved around her kitchen with the same unconscious familiarity he felt in his own. The afternoon light grew softer, and neither of them seemed to notice when it faded into evening. Their conversation drifting as gently as the snow outside. Their tea growing cold as they discussed the merits of different types of honey, the best markets in town, and the peculiar magic of winter cooking. For now, they were just 2 people who loved food, sharing a quiet moment in a warm kitchen while the world grew white and silent outside. Daniel found himself thinking that maybe Vermont wouldn't be so bad after all, even as a small voice reminded him that befriending a food critic, especially this food critic, was probably unwise. But that was a worry for another day. For now, there was just the gentle fall of snow, the lingering scent of burnt sugar, and the surprising comfort of unexpected company. Chapter 2. Family Recipe. The call came on a Sunday morning, while Sophie was photographing steam rising from her morning coffee. Her grandmother's nurse spoke in gentle tones about a minor fall, about precautionary measures, about the hospital being the safest place for now. Sophie barely remembered to turn off her stove before rushing out into the January chill. Hours later, she sat beside her grandmother's hospital bed, watching snow gather on the windowsill outside. Gran looked smaller somehow against the white sheets. But her eyes were as bright as ever. All this fuss over a little stumble, her grandmother said, waving her hand dismissively. I was just trying to reach the old recipe box. Sophie leaned forward, adjusting her grandmother's blanket. The red lacquer one? Why didn't you ask Jenny to get it for you? She's very kind, Gran said. But some things you need to do yourself. She paused, looking out at the falling snow. I was thinking about the Valentine's Day I met your grandfather. Sophie settled back in her chair, recognizing the soft look that came over her grandmother's face when she spoke of the past. These stories were as familiar and comforting as well-worn cookbook pages. It was at the New Year festival, Gran continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. But in China, we celebrated love on the 7th day. I was making sweet rice balls and ginger soup. Your grandfather said the smell reminded him of home. She smiled at the memory. He asked for the recipe every day for a week before I agreed to teach him. Is that the recipe you were looking for? Sophie asked softly. And the sticky rice cake we made together that first Valentine's Day after we moved here. He insisted on celebrating both holidays. Gran's laugh turned into a small cough. We made such a mess of that kitchen, trying to combine American chocolate with Chinese rice cakes. Sophie reached for her grandmother's hand, noticing how delicate it felt. I could make them for you, she offered. Once you're home. Gran squeezed her fingers. The taste is in the technique. The way you fold the dough, how long you let the sugar melt. Her voice trailed off. I should have taught you properly, not just let you watch. You can teach me now, Sophie said quickly, once you're stronger. The doctors say 2 weeks, minimum. Gran sighed. Valentine's Day will be gone by then. Sophie felt the familiar weight of time slipping away, of traditions fading like old photographs. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, how it had always been full of love and patience, even when Sophie had been too busy with her blog to stay for dinner. That evening, Sophie stood in her own kitchen, staring at her phone. She'd been trying to recreate her grandmother's sweet rice balls for hours, but something was always wrong. The texture too sticky, the soup too sharp. Her latest attempt sat cooling on the counter, looking nothing like the perfectly round rice balls of her childhood. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Daniel stood on her porch, holding a copper pot. I heard you've been cooking all afternoon, he said. Thought you might want to try a better pot for keeping consistent heat. Sophie looked at him, then at the beautiful pot, then back at her kitchen, where failed attempts at sweet rice balls were scattered across every surface. She thought of her grandmother. trying to reach that recipe box alone, of techniques passed down through generations, of pride versus love. Actually, she said slowly, I could use some help. Daniel's eyes softened with understanding. Without a word, he stepped into her kitchen, rolling up his sleeves. He moved to the stove, examining her latest attempt at ginger soup with the quiet focus she was beginning to recognize. Tell me about the dish, he said softly. As the night deepened outside her kitchen window, Sophie found herself sharing not just recipes, but memories. The way her grandmother's kitchen smelled during festivals, the sound of her grandfather's laugh when the rice cakes stuck to his fingers, the warmth of family traditions that transcended cultures and calendars. Daniel listened, asking gentle questions about temperatures and textures, his hands steady as he showed her how to cradle the rice flour dough. Like this, he demonstrated, his movements precise but tender. You're not just shaping food, you're shaping memory. Their first successful sweet rice balls emerged just before midnight, perfectly round and gleaming in clear ginger soup. Sophie carefully spooned one into a small container for her grandmother, while Daniel cleaned up with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything in the kitchen. Thank you, Sophie said, watching him dry her bowls. She wanted to say more about how his help meant more than just perfecting a recipe, about how her grandmother would love his careful attention to detail. But the words felt too big for her throat. Daniel placed the last bowl in her cabinet. Food is meant to be shared, he said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, same time tomorrow? We can work on the sticky rice cake next. Sophie nodded, feeling something warm and hopeful unfurl in her chest, like steam rising from a perfect bowl of soup. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in silence, while inside her kitchen, old traditions found new life through borrowed copper pots and shared understanding. Chapter 3. Simmering. February painted Vermont in shades of white and blue, and in two neighboring kitchens, a routine had taken shape. Daniel rose early each morning, before the winter sun could touch the snow. In the quiet darkness, he found himself reaching for his grandmother's copper pots without hesitation now, no longer weighed down by memories of his restaurant's final days. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Sophie's determined expression as she learned to feel the right consistency of dough between her fingers. He'd developed a habit of leaving his kitchen window slightly open while he worked, knowing the morning's experimental aromas would drift next door. Sometimes he caught the sound of her typing. The gentle click of keys, a reminder that she was still writing restaurant reviews. He wondered if her words had grown softer since they began cooking together. Each afternoon, they met in one kitchen or the other. Today, Sophie arrived with a notebook full of interviews, her cheeks still pink from the cold. Daniel listened as she shared stories from local restaurant owners, while he demonstrated the proper way to steam Gran's rice cakes. Marcus from the Jade Garden said something interesting today, Sophie mused, watching Daniel's hands knead dough with practiced ease. He said love is like making noodles. You can't rush it. You can't force it. You have to listen to what the dough tells you. Daniel smiled, remembering his own early lessons in patience. Sounds like a wise man. He is, Sophie agreed, leaning against Daniel's kitchen counter as she stared at her phone. Her expression suddenly changed as she read something on the screen. "Everything all right?" Daniel asked, continuing to work the dough. "Just my editor," Sophie sighed, gathering her notebook. "I should go work on this article. Thank you for today's lesson." She moved toward the door, her footsteps quiet against the wooden floor. Daniel watched her cross the snowy space between their houses, then turned back to his work, thinking about how different this Vermont kitchen felt from his Chicago restaurant. There, every dish had been a statement, every service a performance. Here, cooking had become a conversation, gentle, honest, and somehow more meaningful. Through their connected windows, he could see Sophie settling at her desk. Her laptop casting a soft glow in the growing dusk. The peace of the afternoon was interrupted by a knock at her door. Daniel watched as a woman entered Sophie's kitchen, clutching papers and looking desperate. He recognized her immediately. Martha from the Blue Door restaurant. He'd visited once, anonymously, during his first week in town. Daniel turned away from the window, giving them privacy. But he could feel Martha's recognition in the air between their houses. His hands stilled on the dough he was kneading. It had been bound to happen eventually. Someone would remember the chef from Sullivan's. He heard murmured voices through the open window, catching fragments about Valentine's Day service and last chances. His fingers traced the familiar dent in his grandmother's copper pot, thinking about failure and redemption, about criticism and growth. When he finally looked up, he found Sophie watching him through their windows, her expression full of questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. But there was something else there too. Understanding, perhaps, or hope. The snow began to fall more heavily outside, adding another layer of quiet to the evening. In Sophie's kitchen, Martha was still talking, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of restaurant dreams. In his own kitchen, Daniel stood surrounded by the tools of his trade and the scent of Gran's recipes, wondering if it was time to stop hiding. Between their windows, the winter air carried more than just the aroma of ginger and sweet rice. It carried possibility, the chance to teach and learn, to heal and grow, to find a way forward that honored both the critic and the chef, the past and the future, the heart and the art of cooking. As night settled over their quiet street, Daniel reached for his copper pots once more. Some recipes, like some stories, deserve a second chance at being told. Chapter 4. Unfolded Truths. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Sophie shuffled the papers Martha had brought. Old reviews, photographs of Sullivan's restaurant in its glorious days, snapshots of Daniel in his pristine white chef's coat. Her fingers traced the edges of a review she now realized she had written. "How long did you know?" The question came out quieter than she intended, but it cut through the kitchen's warmth like a blade. Daniel's hands, which had been so confident while teaching her to fold dumplings, now rested motionless on the table. "Know what exactly?" he asked, meeting her gaze directly. "That I was the food critic who wrote about Sullivan's final days," Sophie clarified that I was the one who... She stopped, unable to complete the sentence. The review had been brutal. Not just a critique, but a post-mortem of a culinary dream. She remembered the words she'd carefully crafted. Sullivan's has lost its soul. A once brilliant kitchen now reduced to a pale imitation of its former glory. At the time, she'd considered it honest journalism. Now, sitting across from Daniel, the words felt different. I knew from the first day, Daniel admitted. When I heard your voice recording outside the window, your byline might have changed, but your voice, it was unmistakable. Sophie felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion. You've been teaching me recipes, sharing meals, and you knew who I was the entire time? Daniel's smile was soft, tinged with something between regret and understanding. Would you have opened your door, shared your grandmother's stories, learned to cook if you knew who I was? The question hung in the air, a perfect mirror of their complex connection. I've been trying to understand why you would want to cook with me, Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. Was this some kind of rehabilitation? A way to prove something? No, Daniel said simply. This was about remembering why cooking matters. Why food is more than just presentation or critique. It's about connection. Sophie thought about the meals they'd shared, the way he'd patiently shown her how to fold rice paper, how to feel the consistency of dough, the stories about his grandmother, about cooking as an act of love rather than performance. My reviews destroyed restaurants, she said quietly. I know that. Each word was a calculated strike. Daniel reached across the table, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand. And now? He asked. It was a loaded question. An invitation to see beyond the black and white of professional critique, to the shades of gray where human stories lived. The snow outside continued to fall, soft and relentless. A metaphor, perhaps, for second chances, for the way truth could drift quietly into a space, transforming everything it touched. Why me? Sophie asked finally. Of all the people in Vermont, why share your kitchen with the critic who wrote your restaurant's obituary? Daniel's laugh was soft, unexpected. Sometimes, he said, the person who knows your failures best is the only one who can truly help you find your way back. Outside, the winter light began to fade, casting long shadows across the kitchen. But inside, something was shifting. Not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet realignment. The way a recipe finds its perfect balance. Not through grand gestures, but through careful, patient adjustments. Sophie realized she wasn't angry. Surprised? Yes. Uncertain? Definitely. But there was something else brewing. A recognition of vulnerability, of shared passion, of the complex language of forgiveness that existed beyond words. We should probably finish those dumplings, she said finally. Daniel's smile was answer enough. Chapter 5. Sweet Beginnings. The days following their truth-telling conversation had shifted something between Sophie and Daniel. Their shared kitchen sessions continued, but now carried the weight of understanding, of second chances given and received. Sophie found herself staring at her laptop screen late at night, reviewing her old articles with new eyes. The words that had once felt like precise surgical strikes now seemed to miss the heart of what cooking truly meant. Martha's desperate request still echoed in Sophie's mind. Please, Martha had begged that snowy evening. The blue door has been in my family for 20 years. This Valentine's Day service could save us or break us. We need help. Real help. The kind that only someone who understands both success and failure can give. Sophie had looked through her kitchen window that night, watching Daniel work with his copper pots, and understood exactly what Martha meant. Who better to guide a struggling kitchen than someone who had lived through both triumph and collapse? Who had found his way back to the pure joy of cooking? I'll ask him, Sophie had promised Martha, but not as a favor to me. He needs to want to do this himself. That evening, Daniel stood at his kitchen window, watching the steam rise from a pot of simmering ginger soup. Martha's words, relayed by Sophie, echoed in his mind. The blue door has been in my family for 20 years. He thought about his own restaurant, about how quickly 20 years of legacy could slip away. He remembered the first time he'd visited the Blue Door, during his initial week in Vermont. He'd sat quietly in a corner booth, watching Martha move through her dining room with the same grace his own mother had shown in their family's first restaurant. The food had been simple but honest, every dish carrying the weight of tradition and the warmth of welcome. But he'd also recognized the signs of a kitchen losing its confidence. The slightly too long wait times, the inconsistent seasoning, the hesitation in the server's steps. Daniel lifted the lid of his grandmother's soup pot, inhaling the familiar aroma. He thought about what Sophie had asked him, why he'd want to help Martha after everything he'd been through. The truth was, he saw himself in Martha's kitchen. Not the celebrated chef from Sullivan's, but the scared kid who'd once dropped an entire tray of dumplings during his first restaurant service. His mother had simply helped him up, handed him fresh wrappers, and said, "The only real failure is giving up." "Maybe," he said to the quiet kitchen, "it's time to pass that lesson on." When he told Sophie his decision the next morning, her face lit up with understanding. She'd been testing egg custard buns, her fingers dusted with flour, and for a moment, he was struck by how naturally she moved through her kitchen now. How far she'd come from the woman who'd nearly set her kitchen on fire, making honeycomb candy. "Martha's kitchen doesn't need a star chef," he explained, adjusting the heat under Sophie's wok with gentle fingers. "They need someone who remembers what it feels like to love cooking so much it hurts, and what it feels like to lose that love, and then find it again." Sophie nodded, understanding blooming in her eyes. Like teaching someone to make their grandmother's rice balls. Daniel smiled, remembering how his own hands had trembled the first time he'd picked up his copper pots after Sullivan's closed. Exactly like that. Now, on the morning of Valentine's Day, Sophie stood in her kitchen, carefully arranging sweet rice balls on her grandmother's favorite lacquer tray. Through her window, she could see Daniel methodically packing his copper pots into their carrying cases. He had agreed to help Martha not with grand gestures of culinary expertise, but with the same patient guidance he had shown Sophie in learning her grandmother's recipes. Her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Her grandmother would be released tomorrow, just in time to try their perfected sticky rice cakes. Sophie smiled, remembering the burned caramel that had first brought Daniel to her door. How far they'd both come since then. She was drafting a new blog post, something different from her usual reviews. "The heart of a restaurant," she typed, "isn't found in its plating or its prices, but in the quiet moments between services, in the way a kitchen team moves together, in the stories that simmer alongside the soups." Daniel appeared at her door, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For your grandmother," he said softly. "The copper pot we used for the ginger soup. I think she should have it." Sophie felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning's tea. "Daniel, you can't." "Some tools," he interrupted gently, "need to be part of new stories, like some chefs and some critics." Their eyes met across the threshold, and Sophie found herself thinking about how Martha's request had given them both a chance. Him to step back into a professional kitchen on his own terms. Her to write about food with compassion rather than judgment. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "To meet Gran? After the service tonight?" Daniel's smile was warm enough to melt snow. "I'd like that." Chapter 6. Perfect Blend. As Daniel guided Martha's kitchen through the evening service, he found himself remembering his mother's words about failure and persistence. In each nervous glance from Martha's line cooks, he saw an echo of his own journey, both the fall and the recovery. He showed them what he'd learned in Sophie's kitchen, that sometimes the most important ingredient isn't found in any recipe, but in the courage to keep trying, to keep creating, to keep sharing the love of food that brought them all to this profession in the first place. The blue door glowed like a lantern in the February darkness. Sophie sat at a corner table, her laptop open to a blank document. She had promised Martha a piece about tonight's service, but she wasn't writing a review. She was documenting a resurrection. In the kitchen, Daniel moved with the quiet authority she had come to know in their cooking sessions. She watched through the pass as he guided Martha's staff the same way he had taught her to feel the right consistency of dumpling dough. With patience, understanding, and a deep respect for the process. His copper pots gleamed on the stovetop, their surfaces reflecting the controlled chaos of a kitchen finding its rhythm again. Martha fluttered between dining room and kitchen, her face glowing with more than just the heat from the woks. Each dish that emerged told a story of tradition and innovation, of old wounds healing and new connections forming. Sophie typed, "The measure of a kitchen's heart isn't in its stars or accolades, but in its ability to bring people together, to create moments that linger long after the plates are cleared. Tonight, the blue door reminds us that every restaurant is more than just its food. It's a collection of stories, of dreams, of people brave enough to keep cooking even when the recipe gets difficult." As the evening service wound down, her phone vibrated with a message from the hospital. Her grandmother was asking for her special rice balls. Some cravings, it seemed, couldn't wait until morning. She found Daniel in the kitchen, helping with final cleanup. Martha was there too, tears of joy in her eyes as she read the early feedback cards from customers. Their eyes met across the space, and without a word, Daniel began untying his apron. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the roads empty except for occasional couples leaving late Valentine's dinners. In the back seat, the copper pot held their offering of sweet rice balls. The recipe now a perfect blend of both their teachings. Sophie's grandmother was awake, sitting up in bed with her red lacquer recipe box open on her lap. When she saw Daniel enter behind Sophie, her eyes widened with recognition. Not from Sullivan's reviews or reputation, but from something deeper. "Ah," she said softly, happiness settling in the gentle lines around her eyes. Sharing old recipes has a way of bringing the right people together. They shared the sweet rice balls in comfortable silence. Snow falling gently outside the hospital window. Sophie watched as her grandmother and Daniel discussed the subtle art of ginger soup, their hands moving in identical gestures as they talked about heat and timing and patience. Later, walking through the hushed hospital corridors, Daniel reached for Sophie's hand. His fingers were warm, slightly rough from years of kitchen work. She thought about how some ingredients find each other naturally, how some recipes write themselves, how some stories end exactly as they should. "What happens now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I think we're just getting started," he said. "There are more stories to tell." Outside, the Vermont winter continued its quiet dance. But in their hearts, spring was already beginning to bloom.